Hello, this is Wade here with IG Labs, and thank you for tuning in to today's episode of our Cyber Tech Talk podcast. For today's episode, I'll be covering some of the latest trends in cybersecurity and providing you with some tips to better help protect yourself and your organization. From there, I'll pivot over to IT and OT convergence and give you just a general overview of what it is, some benefits of it, but also make sure you're aware of the risk associated with it. And then last but not least, I'll finish up by providing you with a list of some tools that you can use for your everyday use. Now, before I begin, I think it's important that we take a look back at the year 2021 and review some of the top cyber incidents that occurred. At the top of the list, and this is something that everyone out there can probably relate to, is the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, the Colonial Pipeline is responsible for almost half of the United States East Coast fuel supply. When attackers attacked the pipeline, it forced an emergency shutdown and causing a frenzy among consumers on the East Coast. Pivoting over from the Colonial Pipeline, I think it's also important that I highlight the SolarWinds supply chain attack. In the SolarWinds supply chain attack, attackers first compromised a trusted third-party vendor. From there, they then inserted a backdoor into the software update, which then allowed victims to unknowingly, might I add, download malicious software. To date, this is probably considered one of the most sophisticated cyber operations out there that occurred. It had a wide-reaching effect by affecting federal agencies, courts, private sector corporations, and your state and local governments. Last but not least, I'll follow up with the Apache Log4j vulnerability. This was something that was just discovered in December of 2021. So this is still ongoing, but to date, there's been over hundreds of vendors' products that have been deemed vulnerable. And we're still learning about this day by day. So this will be something that we'll probably even come back to revisit at some point in time. Now that we've had a brief recap of some of the top cyber incidents that occurred in the year 2021, let's shift our focus to some of the current trends that professionals are seeing out there in the industry. As you might imagine, ransomware remains at the top of the list. In fact, just earlier this month, CISA released a joint advisory stating that incidents were observed in 14 of the 16 U.S. critical infrastructure sectors. That is a huge number, by the way. And some of the attack techniques that were observed during this time were phishing, stealing RDP credentials, brute force attacks, and of course, exploiting vulnerabilities. So you're going to hear me say this now, and you're going to hear me say it again. Ensure you are patched. Another trend that I'd like to mention here are remote workforce attacks. Due to the huge shift in remote work, attackers are now taking advantage of vulnerabilities and users' home networks or remote work areas. Before I begin, I'll ask a couple of questions. Just how secure is your home network? Are there any distractions in your home network or remote work area that might make you accidentally click a link that you would otherwise not click or accidentally download a malicious file? Along with remote work attacks, within this attack, attackers are now using a technique referred to as consent phishing. So, of course, they're still going to go after your passwords and everything else, but they've just added another tool to their arsenal. Now, consent phishing is simply going after the permissions and applications that you allow when you're going through things. So, I want you to think about the times when you're at home and you're having to give permissions to an application and you're just going through clicking, allowing everything, and you're doing it for speed, because speed is of the essence to get back to the task at hand. After hearing this, I would advise you to make sure you're always double checking the permissions that you are allowing to be sure that there's nothing malicious. Another trend that goes along with remote workforce attacks are attacks on cloud infrastructure. Due to the recent events over the past couple of years, companies have scrambled and rushed to migrate over to cloud to ensure employees can still work from their remote environment. But during this time, some companies may have prematurely migrated over to cloud or even misconfigured simple settings and things like that. So I always advise to make sure you go back and ensure that your configurations and settings are correct. Another trend that goes in hand with remote workforce attacks are attacks on cloud infrastructure. Due to the increased remote work presence, companies rush to shift over to cloud infrastructure. During this time, by such a quick shift over, it could have caused companies to misconfigure settings, which ultimately open you up to exploitation by enemies and adversaries. As we know, the cyber world never sleeps, and there's someone always actively trying to exploit something. Another trend that I'd like to mention are IoT devices. how many of you out there love your smart watches, your smart fridges, wish I had one, your baby monitors and things like that? Now, this is great, but it is also allowing adversaries to have an increased attack surface. It is estimated that by the year 2027, there will be over 41 billion IoT devices out there. So I'll just let that sink in for a second. If you tuned into our previous podcast when it was talking about AI, this is something that interested me in preparing for this podcast, and that is AI-related attacks. And this is something that is trending upwards. So you have the good in AI, where companies are using AI to automate their security systems, which help them sift through large amounts of data faster than any human ever could. This is beneficial to companies, especially smaller ones where your security team might not be as big. But in turn, adversaries are also using AI for malicious intent. Okay, so now at this point that we've had a time to review some of the cyber incidents that occurred in 2021 and some of the current trends that are out there now, I thought I'd take this time to just go over some of the articles that are out there. So what you see up on the screen is Bleeping Computer, and this is something that I check regularly, just about every day, to just see what's the latest news out there cyber related. Something interesting that I like about them, they do what's called the Week in Ransomware, where they just go through and highlight some of the things that are out there in the world. I'm sure other sites do it as well, but this is a site that I normally go to. So just this week, you had the Conti ransomware group merge with the TrickBot group, which by those two groups merging, it officially makes them a cybercrime syndicate, which sure, they increase their capabilities, cool, but it also raises them on the spectrum as bad actors to go after. And with the recent arrests made in ransomware, I'm sure this is at the top of the list of all the agencies out there. So scrolling down, there you also see, so there's the FBI disclosed that the U.S. critical infrastructure was breached by BlackBite. So what's interesting about that is that if you scroll down and you see the February 13th, as I scroll down here, also the San Francisco 49ers were hit by the same ransomware group. So it's interesting. It would be interesting to see if those two events had any relation to each other. Like maybe they were just going after whatever they could get. But that's also interesting. So even ransomware is playing sports these days. So there's just no end to this in sight, as you can see. Earlier, when I mentioned the remote workforce attacks, there was something called consent phishing, things like that. So apparently in this, hackers slipped into Microsoft Teams chats to distribute malware. I'd be interested to see how they got into it, but reading through this article, they dropped malware into chat. So think back to when you're working remotely from home and just think about potential distractions, or even if you work for a large company, you might think you're getting something from someone that's trusted and is actually an adversary in your network. As you can see, there are over 270 million people who use Microsoft Teams. Like, there's plenty of companies out there that use it for their communications and things like that. So just something else to keep an eye out for and be mindful of that. Hey, I'm remote working from home, but am I protected? And as you can see, like I said earlier, they're just dropping malicious executable files into conversations. It's that easy these days, so that's just something to keep in mind. And then as we further scroll down, you can see that the malware writes data into the system registry, and then which allows you to establish persistence on the machine. That's something. And so just as we keep going on in this cyber world, remember that as adversaries are always looking for ways to attack. So just make sure you are not the reason why your company is compromised. Another article that I thought I'd mention was just CISA giving just a warning of hybrid operations and threats to U.S. critical infrastructure. So this is kind of just talking about the landscape of things that are out there in the world today. You have the Russia-Ukraine situation that's going on. So it's just kind of like a reminder, like, hey, increase your defenses and things like that, because we could potentially be a a target and things of that sort. So as you see, like I said, you have the risk increased by the Russia-Ukraine tensions and things like that. And if you've been keeping up with the situation even earlier in the month and since late last year, Ukraine has been getting hit with all kinds of cyber attacks and different things like that. The government sites have been DDoSed and all different types of attacks. So just wanted to leave you with this article here, just kind of going over some things. And again, I just wanted to highlight a couple of articles here in this time. Now I'm going to go over some things you can do to protect yourself. By this point, you may wonder, well, how can I better protect myself? You can start off by how about investing in your cybersecurity workforce, or how much of your organization's operations are dependent upon your IT. I mentioned earlier with the SolarWinds attack, there was a supply chain through a trusted third-party vendor. When you're making these partnerships, ensure that those third parties are just as serious about their cybersecurity as you are. How about taking a different approach and approaching cybersecurity as a business risk? How about simply knowing what's on your network? I know it sounds silly, but at all times, your admins should know what's on your network. That way, earlier when I mentioned adversaries were using stolen RDP credentials, if you know what's on your network at all times, you should know when something is connected that shouldn't be. So those are different things you could do. And I mentioned it earlier, and I promised you that I'd mention it again, is patch, patch, patch. Make sure automatic security updates are on. And even if they're on, make sure they're working properly. Don't just depend on it being automatically updated. Other things out there are you have your zero trust architecture that a lot of people are trying to switch over to. And you might ask, well, what is zero trust? It's exactly what it is. Assume that no person, device, or application should be trusted by default. You could also implement multi-factor authentication when appropriate and when you can. That is another big step. Something else you can do is ensure your data is backed up, but not only backed up regularly. You don't want to be that person where your company is compromised and you haven't backed up your data in years or something. Make sure you have policies in place to ensure that these things are happening regularly and frequently. These are things, I'm sorry for the rant, but these are just things that you can do to protect yourself, and I get kind of passionate when talking about these things. And also, going back to your backups, make sure they're encrypted. How about that? This is all important. These are just some of the things you can do to protect yourself, and at this point, I'm going to begin the transition over into just talking a little bit about IT and OT convergence. So you might ask yourself, what is IT-OT convergence? And it's simply just the integration of your information technology with your operational technology. So kind of using your OT systems are normally used to monitor events, thinking about things in your industrial control system. So monitoring events and processes and devices, and then you're putting the IT into it. So there are some good things that come with this integration. So some of the benefits of IT-OT convergence are it reduces costs, and it also allows for your departments to kind of come together, because before your IT and OT were separate and they never talked. And then like you have your OT professionals that something might not look obvious to them, but you get an IT person and they're like, oh no, this is bad. This is really, really bad. And another benefit is that it's more efficient asset management because you have that IT aspect in there. Now, like everything, with the good, there also comes some challenges. Of course, with the convergence of IT and OT, you have the cybersecurity risk. There's a lot of things being hacked on a daily and different things like that. But again, something you could do to mitigate that is apply techniques such as zero trust. Also, another risk is, like I mentioned earlier, IoT devices. Like I said, by 2027, there was an estimated 41 billion IoT devices. And just be careful when you're implementing those things like that into your environment. Training used to be a big issue, but there are more things that are coming along to help with the convergence of IT and OT. Even CISA has training out there that you can do now. And even we offer training here at IntelliGenesis for IT and OT convergence. I gave you some benefits and I gave you some challenges with IT and OT, but who benefits from IT and OT? So There's plenty of places that could, but I thought I'd highlight a few. So think about your military and law enforcement, and how does IT and OT help them? Think about that for a second. Well, it can help them with the coordination, a rapid deployment of resources, and things of that nature. And then while also giving you insight into the conditions of the environment that you may be in. Utility companies. Think back, I remember back when I was a kid and you'd have the company coming out to actually look at your actual meter. I haven't been out back to look for an actual meter in a while, but I'm pretty sure with the IT OT convergence, that industry benefits greatly from that. Lastly, I thought I'd mention the medical and pharmaceutical. This allows for medical devices to exchange and share patient information in real time, which could save lives. Like, that is amazing. So at this point, you may wonder, well, that sounds good, but do you have any advice for me or things that I could do to make sure this is a smooth transition? Smooth, I'd say. And some simple things you can do, I advise, just make sure you're communicating your IT and OT teams. Like, make sure your roles and responsibilities are clearly defined. Know what you're supposed to do and know your duties, responsibilities. Make sure your IT team knows what they're supposed to do and your OT team is aware of their responsibilities as well. And also just how about use proper tools? That's something else that you can do. So at this point in the podcast, I'd like to just take some time to just kind of go over some of the tools out there that you can use. And actually, it's kind of convenient that CISA, they posted an extensive list on their site of the different tools out there that you can use. So at this point, we're going to kind of just navigate through the web page and just kind of see what's on their site. And I'll also highlight a couple that stood out to me also at the end of this. So to begin, you have, let's scroll down, let's see. You have CISA's vulnerability scanning tool. Now, that should be something that it's free. So, hey, let's see what it's worth. You could never scan too much for vulnerability. So that's awesome that they have that on this site. And also what's cool about this site, they have what the service is, the skill level, and who actually owns it. And they give you a brief description. So according to this, just your basic user could use this. And they have a couple other phishing, since phishing is also a top trend that's always out there. That's something else, a campaign assessment. You can, let's see what else they have. You have your Microsoft Defender antivirus. That's something that I have on my home systems as well. As we scroll down, these are all still basic level. Let's see if we can get down into some of the more advanced things and see what's out there. So you have CrowdStrike CRT, and it's a tool, as you can see, that it says that it's designed to help organizations quickly and easily review excessive permissions in their environment. So that's kind of cool, and it's free as well, so that's also awesome. Let's keep scrolling down. Let's see what else out there is in advance. Let's see. We're scrolling. Oh, you have the Mandiant Threat Intelligence. So that's actually kind of neat as well. I actually have an account with them, so I can view their threat intelligence reports too. And they have some cool things on their website. When you have an account, you can go through and you can search the different threat actors out there. And what's kind of cool, they have a function in there where you can take and search the threat actor, and it automatically maps it to the MITRE matrix, which is also kind of awesome up there. Then you also have your Splunk out there, which helps for like your logs and stuff like that. So those are more of your advanced things, but it's still kind of cool to just highlight here some of the things they have in here. And let's just scroll down and see what else they have. As you can see, this list is extremely long. You have your Palo Alto Networks Unit 42, actionable threat objects and mitigations. And actually, they also publish pretty good reports on like cyber threats out there. If you've never been to their site, it's also a good site to check out for some of their stuff out there. And then there are also other just different GitHub repositories. And then as we continue to scroll down, you see that there's just a lot of these different things out here. So I advise you in your free time to just go on here and look. You have Virus Total on here. And as you keep scrolling down, you have your snort rules and stuff. There's plenty. And now that we're on tools, I'll pivot over to just kind of give you just kind of a brief view of what the MITRE site is, so you can see what's there. Some of the cool things about the MITRE website, you can simply just go to, let's say for example, your groups. And this kind of just gives you a breakdown of the different groups out there, so you can just get a general understanding of just indeed how large the attack surface is. So you have that, and then when you go to the actual matrix, it's the whole MITRE matrix, and you can see the different steps within the matrix. So these are just some of the tools out there. I won't go into too much detail, but if you're interested, I definitely recommend checking out CISA's website, where they have this extensive list of all of the tools on there. Before I go, I'd also like to note that for your MITRE attack, it also has you have your ICS, your mobile, and also your cloud as well now. So it's very extensive, and you can definitely play around in it a lot. But again, like I say, I won't go too in depth. If you have the CISA website, I'll go to it again for you. 1 second. Go to it again. Just the CISA website right here, CISA.gov, free cybersecurity services and tools. There's plenty of tools on here you can go through, and hey, if you're curious and bored, I recommend just playing around in them and see what you can do with some of them. This is Wade here at IG Labs, and thank you for tuning in to today's podcast.